Hi everybody. So today I'm going to go over how to create a layered apple painting step by step, which is something that we do in painting 1. It really focuses on creating layers and using your skills of observation to identify highlights and shadows in your paintings. So first step is to divide your paper into 8 sections and number them, and then you're going to take a pencil and very lightly, and I'm doing this dark so you can see, draw this apple shape with a shadow attached in all 8 of your boxes. So repeat this 8 times. Then for step number 2, we're going to start to add some paint. Now the paint that I used was some Blick acrylic paint, and I also use a Blick acrylic artist medium. I mix the medium in with all of the paint just to thin it, to dilute it a little bit so that it goes on a little easier. So you can see as I'm painting, the first apple that I created is done. So that's just to identify that step number 1 is drawing. I'm not going to do anything else with that apple. Now on boxes 2 through 8, I'm going through and I'm giving my apple a coat of a medium green paint. To get this green color, I used white, yellow, and green, mixed them together until I felt like it was the color that I wanted. You don't want this to be too dark, otherwise the rest of your layers are going to be really difficult, but you also don't want this to be too super light. And as you notice, I'm going through, and like I said earlier, I'm painting every apple except for the first one. Now after I have my apple painted, I'm going to go through and give my shadow a base coat. Now to get the color for the shadow, I started with white. Anytime you mix a white or a light color, you want to start with white and mix the color in. And I used white, a tiny bit of black, and then some green so that it goes along with my apple color. Now my last portion of step number 2 is to create the stem. I painted over it when I was using my base coat of green, so I'm mixing up a little bit of brown and a little bit of black and adding that stem. Once I have this in boxes 2 through 8, that's going to be the final step to step 2. Now for step 3, I'm going to go through and I'm actually going to start adding some shadows. So I've already gone ahead and mixed up 3 different shades of gray for the shadows, and I've also mixed up 3 different shades of green for my apple. So what you can see right now is I'm going through to add a slightly darker portion to my shadow. It's not too dark, there's not too much contrast, and I want it to blend pretty smoothly into the light shadow that I've already painted. Once that's done, I'm going to go through and start to add a dark shadow to my apple. Now notice all the places that I'm putting this shadow. I'm going along and following an image that is linked to your Google Classroom if you're watching this and you're in my class. I found this image and it actually is a tutorial on how to shade an apple with a particular computer program. But I really like the way that they layer, and so we use that image as reference. So the way that I have this shadow curving is all based off of the image that I'm looking at. One thing to note is that your transition between values, so where I'm adding the dark shadow over the light, I don't want it to feel too stripey. So what I found worked really well is if I mixed a little bit of medium in with my paint, I was able to go through and kind of smooth over that line. Acrylic paint dries really fast, so if you don't do this quick enough, you're going to end up with a stripe, which, depending on your taste, doesn't always look that great. Now as we finish up step 3, notice how we only did step 3 on boxes 3 through 8. So now as we move on to step 4, we're going to leave boxes 1, 2, and 3 alone, and we're going to add to boxes 4 through 8. So in the end, each box will look different. So you can see that I'm going through, and with one of my darker green values I added, I'm going through and deepening the shadows. So I'm deepening the shadow on the left side and also a little bit in the pit of the apple. Now when I add this shadow, the same thing applies to the previous step. I don't want it to feel too stripy. I want it to blend in, have a smooth transition. And I just want adding this shadow to create a little extra pop of contrast. Now, continuing on this step, I need to add another pop of dark gray to the shadow. So you can see so far I have 3 different values in my shadow. I'm adding the third right now, and I have 3 different values in my apple, a light, a medium, and dark. Now the same thing goes for the shadows. I'm using medium to smooth over the transition, so there's not too much of a drastic change between values here. Now for step 5, I'm going to only be doing this on apples 5, 6, 7, and 8. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are done. And basically what's going to happen is I'm going to start to add some highlights. And you can notice that while I was mixing up my lighter value there, I accidentally spilled some white paint on my one apple, apple number 7. So it got a little wonky, but what are you going to do? So I mixed up a lighter value of green, and that I did by starting with white, and I actually mixed a decent amount of yellow in and then just a little bit of green because I want to show some dimension. I don't want it all to be green. I want to add some different colors like yellow in there too. And I'm going through and adding that pop of highlight on the right side of my apple because that's where my light source is. And again, as I'm doing this, I'm looking at a reference image, so I'm making sure to follow along with that. Also in step 5, I'm going through and adding a final pop of dark along the shadow to deepen that even further. Okay, so now we're on to step number 6. So again, we're just doing that to apples 6, 7, and 8. And this is the fun part. This is where they start to come to life. So here I mixed up a very light value, mostly white with a tiny, tiny bit of the yellow-green from the last step in it. And I'm going through and just adding pops on all 3 of the apples. And here I switched video so the lighting got a tiny bit different, so sorry for that. Anyway, I'm going through and adding this pop of highlight, and again, I'm following that reference image, so I'm observing what I see in that image, and I'm doing my best to recreate it here. Here I do want there to be quite a bit of contrast, so I'm not trying to blend it in or smooth it too much. So now you're going to see me go in with some of the medium green tones that I created to go through and blend some of the transition, especially behind the stem of the apple. I wasn't too crazy with how that was turning out, and so I'm going through and trying to make that transition just a little bit smoother. And that looks pretty good for step number 6. So now on to step number 7. So I only have 2 steps to go. This is where I'm going to start to add some texture to my apple. So I use the values that I had mixed up already, and I'm going through and just kind of speckling with a tiny fine point brush. I could also use the back of my brush, and I'm kind of dabbing onto the apple to create that texture. I'm going to do that on apple number 8 as well. And I want to make sure that it doesn't look too polka dotty. I want the speckles to blend in a little so they look like the texture of the apple, but they don't stand out too much. Then it would look just like a polka dotted apple or an apple with a weird disease, and we don't want that. Now in the previous step, I didn't mention that I went through and mixed a little bit of blue with my dark green to deepen my shadows a bit. You can see that in steps 6, 7, and 8. Now in the rest of step number 7, I'm going through and just adding some finishing touches. I'm smoothing in some greens, I'm adding some highlights to the stems, and just overall making sure that I'm happy with the results. The transitions are smooth, it doesn't look too choppy. So now into step number 8, which is my finishing touches. I'm going through with a white that I did not mix with medium, and I'm adding just some really bright pops of highlight. I'm going through and paying attention to the curvature of the apple so that it feels realistic and makes it feel like an apple that is actually on your paper. So here you can just see the different steps that I did to create my apple, steps 1 through 8. And the reason that I do this assignment with my students is because I think it's really important, number 1, to be able to paint using layers, and number 2, to be able to learn to observe. So when you have to look at an image and observe the changes in highlights and shadows and build them up using layers is what's going to get you a very realistic looking painting. Thanks for watching, everybody, and good luck painting.